So many of us think about saving as like locking money away in a safe, never touching it again, telling yourself you can't have the thing that you want. But saving is just setting aside money that you're going to spend later.
Yeah.
It's not money that you can't spend ever.
Welcome to the Rich and Regular podcast, where we explore life at the intersection of money. I'm Julian.
And I'm Kirsten. And today we're talking about how to align your money goals with ease.
Okay.
Yes. And
Ease.
this isn't, ease. And this isn't a sponsored episode, but I do want to shout out the good folks at Ally Bank and UnitedMasters for putting on this event called SelectCon this weekend, where I was on a panel talking about this very thing.
Yes.
And when I posted that I was going to be speaking about this on Instagram, I believe, it might have been YouTube. I don't remember where the comment was, but somebody suggested that we should do a podcast episode on it. And I was like, you know what? That's a good idea. So here we are. I don't normally do this. The panel was yesterday. Today is Sunday morning, and we're recording this episode to be released tomorrow.
Yeah.
We don't normally do that, but keep it fresh, keep it interesting. And I didn't want to wait too long because I want to be able to share my favorite questions or themes from the conversation. So
yeah, that's interesting. I did not see that comment. What I did see, though, was a lot of our friends in New York and those who are in the creative and entertainment industry, like, oh, wow, that's crazy. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Like, shout out to you guys. Glad you being a part of SelectCon. I'm not going to lie, I'd never even heard of it.
Yeah.
Until the opportunity presented itself. And then when I started seeing the specific people that I knew, like I said, from New York, I was like, oh, wow, this is actually pretty cool. Once I started digging into it, realizing that I did know UnitedMasters, but I didn't know SelectCon. Like, I knew Steve Stout. I knew the work that he was doing. I did not know that there was an event. And I certainly didn't know that there was a financial angle to it. So I'm glad that we were able to take part in it, even though you did all the heavy lifting.
Yeah,
like, that
heavy
might have
beat.
been my favorite.
Oh, you speak French now.
Yeah, I was the plus one and really enjoyed that experience. So
I'm glad you brought up SelectCon because I want to start there and just set the tone and tell people a little bit about the event because it's actually really cool. And this is like the 10th year. I don't know if it's the 10th year or the 10th one, but They've been doing it for a while. So a little bit about it, it's hosted by UnitedMasters, which is basically an alternative to a traditional label for indie musicians, independent artists. So unlike traditional record labels, UnitedMasters enables artists to retain their full ownership and own the masters of their recording art, right? So like their whole thing is around independence and changing the narrative of what it means to be an artist. So they do these events called SelectCon across the country. They're not just in Atlanta. We just happen to be at the Atlanta one, where they allow indie artists to come in and learn from heavy hitters. So at this one, there was Jermaine Dupri was there, Pinky Cole was there. Of course, the founder, Steve Stout, which if you're not familiar with him, he's a former record label executive who founded this company because he knew there was an issue.
And advertising.
Yeah.
Giant behind the scenes.
Yes.
Of, like many of your favorite cross-cultural crossover acts. So.
Yes. And other cities have had people like Swiss Beats. They try to keep it regional and local and relevant, but it's a number of people that you can learn from. And obviously a part of the message of being an independent artist is financial literacy. So they have these partnerships with Ally Bank that create these panels that feature heavy hitters like myself. Heavy hitters like myself. And I was on the panel with Ronnie Brown, who also leads a community of women who own businesses, to have these conversations around the other stuff, the budgeting, the investing, the things that you need to do to actually live and ultimately retire.
Yeah. Well, I would also say like there's also that element of entrepreneurship. And that's for me what was actually most interesting. And I think part of the reason why I enjoyed it, like aside from watching you in your element and being able to record and take pictures and those kinds of things. And also just like enjoying the vibe. Like it was a really, really cool vibe. Like
it was
food trucks and DJs and bars,
and outdoors,
private sections,
like
really, really cool. I don't get out much. So, I'm not saying
it don't take much.
It don't take much. It was like, oh, they had a chocolate fountain. And I was like, wow, that was amazing. But
it's free.
Oh man. But I think what I appreciated, because again, I'm like a literal fly on the wall, which is technically how I feel whenever I'm like behind the camera. I feel like I'm invisible, or it's like either or. I'm like either invisible or I'm like all in the way. But I was able to glean so many insights, and it helped me think about like not only just like why, what Steve Stout and what United Masters is doing is so important. Because if you're not like a creative or a music professional, you might say like, all right, there's nothing, relevant for me. This isn't for me, but there really, really is. Right.
Yeah.
And I did not expect that, but it was really around that entrepreneurship piece too, like maximizing your opportunity as an entrepreneur. And so I think there was actually, and I would really recommend anyone who is considering taking the leap out of corporate and striking out on their own, if you have an opportunity to attend one, because it's free, right?
It's free.
It's completely free. There's so much that you can learn there, because the kinds of questions that these independent artists have are very similar to the questions that a lot of entrepreneurs have. Like, well, how do you do it? Because we're
when do you pivot?
Accustomed to being formally employed, or you're so accustomed to one single labor model. You know what I mean? And what he's doing here is like changing the game and saying, no, I want you to win. I want you to own your intellectual property. I'm here to help you, teach you how to better market yourself, instead of what most people are doing, and they get excited about it, is I'm just going to sign this deal. And I think the label, or if it's an author, or the imprint, or the publisher is going to do everything. It was like, no, you still have to do a lot, like the majority of the heavy lifting. Like your success is largely dependent on you. And so it's a matter of like you taking advantage of that opportunity, but recognizing a different way of viewing that partnership. And I think that's what was really, really impressive to me.
Yeah.
So the panel you were on was called The Soft Life, How to Understand and Align Your Money Goals with Ease. It was led by Jack Howard, who we met a couple of years ago, I believe.
Yeah, at FinCon.
I don't remember which one. We've been to several. But she'd come up with that topic. She is the head of, I believe, wellness at Ally Bank, which we're big fans of Ally. We've worked with them on a couple of things in the past, but this was probably the best thing that we've worked with them on. The first thing that came to mind was this idea of a soft life. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. Because like there's, just gonna like flat out say it, like there is a level of femininity that comes with the word soft life. Yeah. And so I felt like, all right, well, and at first it was like I'm attending like a women's event or a women's panel. And I started thinking about it. And as you guys were going on and on and on, I was like really curious. I was like, well, there's actually a lot of men in the room. So this is just interesting. Like, what does that really, really mean? So all of that to say, like, how would you define what a soft life is?
Yeah, there is not a single definition. There's certainly some social media posts and hashtags that allude to a soft life is full of all of these consumeristic things. Massages, not working, nice clothes, international vacations. Like it's very spendy. The way that I define it is a life that embraces comfort and less stress, right? It's about finding that balance between traditional hustle culture and then using a portion of your income to take care of yourself. Right. Like that's how I define it. But the way that it's been constructed online, the visual of a soft life is something that now everybody wants, but very few people are talking about how much it costs.
Yeah, it sounds more like a luxe life and a sedated life.
Yes, exactly.
Like as you're describing it, I'm like, oh, I know what corner of the internet you're talking about. Like all the soft-spoken people and all that I don't like, it's like I just walk on the wind.
Yes.
And okay, I know what you're talking about.
And it's a slippery slope for entrepreneurs because a lot of entrepreneurs will have a great year, like an amazing year. They hit all their goals and then they get burnt out and they're like, oh, now I'm about that soft life. I'm in my soft life era. And what it means when you incorporate the version that you just said, sedated and sleepy.
Like
I like that. Sedated and sleepy. You will mess around and ruin your business because your business still requires a level of effort, a level of work. And so our conversation was about finding the soft life as an entrepreneur, as a creator, as a person who's interested in it while being financially responsible. So how do you do that without going into debt, without ruining your business, without feeling entitled to things that you haven't necessarily earned yet?
That's interesting because I don't want to make this a gendered conversation, but like that idea I don't believe exists with men. I'm sure there's certain corners. Like if anything, you think so?
Yes.
Well, for me,
a number of men who drive cars they can't afford. It's not necessarily sleepy and sedated.
That's what I'm referring to. Like to me, it's grind life. So it looks like it's the other side of the coin, right? It's like the grind life and the grind culture, and you got to get it. And I don't do little things. I outsource all these things. And this is a tax write-off and all of those things. Like it feels like these are kind of kissing cousins. They come from the same element of, I want this ease, but how do I get all these things without completely going broke in the process?
Correct.
Which I find to be impossible. I'm not a big fan of impossible questions, but that's not what this was really about. It was about like balance and self-care, also recognizing that, yes, hard work is important, but it's also important to be mindful of what your limits are and not to completely burn yourself out emotionally or mentally, or even like financially. You don't want to you lose all your money just because you don't feel like driving. You'd rather just have a driver or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Or you'd rather have a nice car that makes it easier to get the things that you want in life, whether it's a parking spot up front, valet park your stuff in the front, or meeting a person that you like, or being perceived as wealthy when you walk into a room. Those are things that also add to a layer of ease in life. And people will spend a lot of money to ensure that they get that privilege.
I think it boils down to the idea of what's more commonly known as value-based spending, right?
Yes.
Like I value certain things. That's what I spend my money on. And I essentially eliminate or limit, reduce, whatever you want to call it, all of the things that just really don't add value or don't align with your values. Jack asked you what your values were. And I was actually interested too, because I was like, I don't know that we get asked that question that often. It's a big question. True. But you said three things that I wrote down, and I'm sure you remember them. But you said ease, simplicity, and pleasure.
Yeah.
And I had just finished listening to the Janelle Monáe album. Was it Pleasure or something or another? But she's
what is
in her,
it called? That's the album. She's
in her pleasure season.
Yes.
So I was like, I wonder if she just said that because we just finished listening to that.
No,
no. But I want to ask a little bit more about that, like where, because we talk often, right? And I was also surprised by your answers. So those values: ease, simplicity, and pleasure. And by the way, there's an Instagram comment you need to reply to because someone specifically called out your response and they got a lot from it. And so it's been a pretty good reaction so far.
Yeah.
So how do you, can you just explain a little bit more about your response and why those are your most important values?
That's my evolved response, because my typical response, my previous response would have just been ease and pleasure. I actually said sustainability, not simplicity, but simplicity is up there. It's right up there. It's probably a 4-legged stool instead of a 3-legged stool, but it was ease, sustainability, and pleasure.
Okay.
And I used to confuse easy, which is a temporary feeling, with ease, which is a state of being. And when I was doing that, I would trade off the things that I knew I needed to be saving for because there were other options that were easier. It was easier for me to hire somebody to come clean my house for $400 versus taking 6 hours and actually doing it myself. It was easier to go get my nails done versus actually figuring out how to make them look acceptable myself. And so when I swapped it for ease in the latest iteration of my life, I also added in sustainability, which means the ability for it to be lasting. There were things that were easy that were not sustainable for my lifestyle, either because they eroded my budget, or they took away from what I was trying to do, or I just didn't enjoy them. Like, I'm just the type of person that does not enjoy sitting in a nail salon for 2 hours, inhaling a bunch of powder. Like, that's just not me. I know women who love it, and there probably is a version of it that I would love. I just haven't found it yet. And maybe I won't ever. But right now, that habit was not sustainable for me. And so I added in sustainability to balance out my default reaction to do things that are easy, but not necessarily sustainable. And then I added in pleasure as that third element because I like to have fun with my money. I want it to feel fun. I want to derive pleasure from earning it and spending it. And so when I add that element, it means that there's a boundary there. There are certain things that I won't do for money because I don't find pleasure in them. And there are other things that I don't spend my money on because I don't find pleasure in it. So it's just like this checks and balance system that has evolved over a lot of trial and error. Like I said, it was not always this balanced, but that's where I am right now at this stage. And it may change. In 5 years, it might be different.
It was interesting because, again, I was learning as well. I was like, because typically, it's safe to say we work together, right? So I hear and pretty much can answer some of these questions, or I know what she's going to say, because we've had that conversation before. And so I was genuinely surprised by your response. Even when you said sustainability, thank you for correcting me. I thought it would actually throw some people off. right? Because I know, at least in my mind, when I think about sustainability, I was thinking about the environment. I was like,
I know everybody goes to climate change.
I was like, she's not. No, she's not. I mean, we're mindful of it, but I wouldn't call that a core value. I'm just being honest, right? Like we eventually, maybe we'll get there, but I wouldn't call it like a core value that like guides our decisions or guides you. And so I was really curious to see how people would respond to that, or whether or not they were confused. But they weren't. I think they all kind of understood exactly what you were saying and where you were going. And in fact, I think, at least from what I saw, because, you know, you were blinded by the bright lights. What I saw was a lot of people almost like having like an exhale, because I think the intended reaction, I think you were spot on, was that you were hinting towards the fact that I think we're all just finally admitting that we feel the pressure. Like, it's one thing to read the news or read an article and hear about inflation or hear about tough times, but sustainability of it all, right? I think it's a very mature point of view to recognize that, yes, anybody can pop for a second. Anyone can go through a really, really hot season. But when you get old enough to realize that very few of these things last forever, and I think you even mentioned that, right? Like, whether you're an entrepreneur or whether you're reaching your peak earning years in your career, you really want to be mindful of the expenses that you build into your lifestyle, right? So
that's it.
It may bring you pleasure today, but can you sustain that? Can you sustain that car note?
And will you always feel that way?
I had an offline conversation with one of the young ladies that work at Ally, because we had met them when we were in Charlotte, and we were all just kind of talking about, listen, man, we're glad that we bought our homes when we did, and we were all glad that we did not buy bigger, that we did not overspend. You know what I mean? Because what we have is something that we can afford today, and even if things kind of get rocky in the future, there's some confidence that comes. But there was also a lot of conversation about like inner work. And again, this is how, you know, I was like out of my element, because I was like, all right, here she go again, but like, she gonna lose people. But I think a lot of people were kind of really understanding too, like, yo, like, you're right. Like, you know, they just kind of felt like seen and heard by what you were saying, which I thought was really, really cool. But talk to me a little bit more about what you meant specifically by the inner work and how that guides your decisions in the way that you think about money and budgeting. Now, that might be different from how you did like years ago.
I always feel the need to stress inner work and the fact that this is a very personal journey whenever I'm sitting on a panel and I'm positioned as an expert, because people will hear the things that I say, which I try to be as specific as possible, talking about the things that I do and don't do. And when I say things like, I don't get my nails done every 2 weeks, I don't get my hair, I don't have cable, you know, I do these things.
Somebody even just responded. I think it was Jack. It was, oh no, ain't no way, right?
That's exactly what happens.
And what's interesting is that, I mean, I stopped counting. I don't even know. Like, I don't know the last time I've had cable. We haven't, you know, it's just not a value of mine, you know? And sorry, not to cut you off, but like, it's just always interesting to me to see how that's still a thing for some people, even though they don't really enjoy it, even though they know that 40% of it is just like commercials, like you're paying to be marketed to.
Yeah.
That's like, I don't derive pleasure from that.
Right.
You know what I mean? If anything, I would pay to not be marketed to.
Yeah, I always double down on inner work for that reason, because people hear what I'm saying and they hear it as advice versus just storytelling and feedback. And the point is, you have to do your own work. Those are my values. Those are the things that I don't appreciate and for my budget. But the other women on the panel were quick to be like, nah, I mean, you can not that. Like, I got to get my nails done. I got to be in the hair salon. I'm not saying you don't have to get your nails done at all. I'm not saying you even have to touch your nail budget, but I'm just saying you have to do the work and get into your expenses, the things that you're spending money on, and ask yourself, because there are levels within every expense category. Even before we got on the panel, the girls were talking in the back, and both of them used to be blonde. And they realized that like the maintenance required for blonde hair, as short as their hair is, was just too much. They had to pay $600 every time they wanted color. And then they had to pay $200 to keep up. And then 2 weeks later, their roots would be out. And then their hair would be affected by the blonde. And so they love blonde hair. They love what it does. They love how they're seen. But they both went back to black because of the maintenance required. So that's just an example. They still get their hair done. They just don't get it done in that way. There's a difference between getting your nails painted and getting them bedazzled and getting art on each one. That could be your thing. Maybe you value it. But if there's a season in your life where you can't do it, then you can still go. Just don't get the extras. Even with us in our groceries. there's value in being able to shop at a Whole Foods where there's a hot bar and you can grab your lunch and you can try some new probiotics and new coconut water or whatever else in their vast beverage display. But there are seasons of my life where I don't need all that. And I can just go to Aldi and get what I need for 40% cheaper.
Right.
So it's really about just acknowledging that your budget is not necessarily a reflection of your personality. It's a reflection of your values in that moment and how you want to use your money as a tool, as a means to illustrate them.
Yeah, it was interesting. There were so many moments where I was in the crowd. And again, obviously I was there as a plus one and as your videographer / photographer. But there was a point where there were 2 points. One, there was one where Jack, the moderator, the head of wellness at Ally, mentioned the book, and she was talking about some of the things that you were known for. And it's just, first of all, it was just kind of cool. I was like, wow, that's amazing. But also watching her shout out the book and then literally watching people type it into their phones and like look it up and like add it to their card and those kinds of things. So shout out to everyone who bought the book yesterday, who might be listening, was like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize you were looking over my shoulder. But there was another
creep.
I know it felt kind of creepy because I was
mess around and see a nude come through or something.
I know. But there was another point where she started talking about fire. And again, that was, it's how I know I live in a bubble because we've answered the question hundreds of times in the past, but then you realize that, yes, there are still people who've never heard of it. They have no idea what that is. And so you were expanding it. And the real question that Jack asked was around finding that balance between the soft life while also trying to pursue financial independence. And I think you answered that really, really well. But can you tell me a little bit more about your response? And like, it's very similar to what you were saying just now about value-based spending, but can we talk a little bit more about like how you think a lot of people can find that balance that they're looking for?
Yeah, that frugality, which I don't like the word either. I've said this before, like frugality just sounds like a struggle. I wish there was a
struggle.
Like there should be a sexier word for intentional spending, but frugality is not an F word. It's not something that we have to be afraid of. It's not something that we have to feel like is a competing interest against the soft life. Like it's just an intentional way of spending. But one of the ways that you can kind of take the edge off of that feeling is to pay yourself first. Like that is the key, the hack, the secret is to just pay yourself first.
Yeah.
You know how they say abs are made in the kitchen, which feels counterintuitive because everybody in the gym doing sit-ups and whatever else you do for abs, pull-ups, buying that little wheel. And then somebody messes around and says, abs are made in the kitchen, right? That's the difference of paying yourself first or just always trying to align your financial goals with your budget and making it this active exercise. When you set that money aside off the top and automate that savings and investment, you don't have to think about it anymore. You can do what you want with the rest of your expenses because you've taken care of that core foundational part. You're not trading off your future or the things that you want in the future for anything right now because you've already set that money aside.
Yeah.
I also think it requires us to reframe how we think about saving because so many of us think about saving as like locking money away in a safe, never touching it again, telling yourself you can't have the thing that you want. But saving is just setting aside money that you're going to spend later.
Yeah.
It's not money that you can't spend ever.
Right.
So
to your point, like psychologically or emotionally, I think we see it as such a restrictive, self-inflicted tactic.
Yes.
And it's like, nah, you're building towards something. Like to your point on like reframing, it was like, no, I'm building towards future ease or future big purchases or future vacations or, whatever it is that you're looking forward to.
And it's still yours.
Yeah.
Like when you're at a restaurant and they bring you a big old plate of food and you're like, I know I'm not going to finish this. You eat until you're full and then you ask for a little to-go box for you to eat later. The same is true when your check comes in. You're looking at it like, oh man, I know I ain't gonna spend all this. You have to develop the same intuition that you have with things like food, with your income, because otherwise you will overspend. Just like you will overeat. Like you have to
indulging,
yes, you have to figure out like what that full level is, what that enough level is, and then know that the rest is still yours. you still get to have it. You just get to have it later.
Yeah, it's always interesting how differently we answer things, which makes sense. We're two completely different people, but like I never answer those kinds of questions that way for me. Like when it comes to like the whole pay yourself first thing, because to me, it's not just about like the importance of automation, even though that is very important. It's a great way to do it. And just sort of training yourself to live on whatever is left after you've paid yourself and set aside money for retirement or whatever it is. Like that to me, I think is a really powerful tactic. But I think it's also for me an acknowledgement of how much credit we give ourselves. And I think that's true not just for people who are creative entrepreneurs or creatives. I think you see a lot of that in people who work traditional jobs. We tend to just give ourselves so much credit and like, I'll make up for it later, right? Like creatives especially, right? Like they tell themselves, I don't have a traditional job. As a result, I don't have a 401k. As a result, I can't save for retirement and I can't invest because I don't have those kinds of jobs. But what I am doing eventually, because I'm hardworking, talented, and I'm networking, that one day when I pop, then I can make up for it on the end, right? A traditionally employed person might look at that and be like, that sounds really, really crazy. That's risky. I would never do that. Meanwhile, what they do is they say, oh, well, I'm not going to start investing until I'm making, this much more money, or I'm not really going to like even consider investing a little bit more until I'm really secure and everybody is in my family good, because I don't want to make the investment and then have to pull it out for any reason. So it's best to just not make it at all, right? So there's always going to be a reason for you not to save or invest or something like that. Which, to your point, is like why it's so important to just go ahead and automate it. But for me, I think the one of the bigger issues that I see is that we just keep continually give ourselves so much credit, even though, like in most cases, you wouldn't be here, you wouldn't be listening to this podcast, you wouldn't be reading our book, you wouldn't be taking our class or whatever it is if you had all those answers. Like most cases, it's really not just a matter of not knowing what something is; it's a matter of overcoming these really, really deep, stubborn habits
Gut
and
instincts,
the psychological effect of like, oh my gosh, but if I do this, what if this thing happens? And as a result, I'd rather not do anything at all. And that takes reps and years and community and people to overcome so that you can like not fall into that cycle of inactivity. I want to pivot for a second because I think it was right after your session was when Steve Stout came in. I remember watching him come in and I was like, oh, this is Steve Stout. Seen him on TV, who knows how many times, and watched him lead this panel where he was talking about the importance of creatives like not signing these deals and what makes a bad deal, and basically saying like you have completely given away all your rights to these people in perpetuity. You know what I mean?
Forever.
And forever. Like they own your name, your likeness, all these things. Like you guys are signing horrible deals. We don't do that here. This is why we're like encouraging you all to think this way and to join us in this effort to revolutionize the industry. What's interesting to me is that so many people who are traditionally employed can look at this and say like, oh, that's important for them, because I've heard a lot of horror stories of my favorite artists and creatives and musicians, like who I thought was on top of the world. And you can name a list of musicians who signed bad deals. And as a result, it led to a pretty hard life, no pun intended. But I don't think that a lot of traditionally employed corporate employees identify with this, even though they do the exact same thing, right? So in exchange for your labor, right, this company, your employer, they own your time. They have placed a cap on your earning potential.
Yep.
And they have you agreed at a discount, right? They own the pace of your development, right? And so there's only so much budget that we are going to put towards you learning any new skill. And there are limits to what we are willing to pay. Like it pretty much has to have a direct and immediate impact on your ability to do your job more.
Yeah.
Until recently, and at certain levels, like you also would have had a built-in non-compete clause.
Yeah.
So you can't even leave here and go work for a competitor because you might be giving up our trade secrets. But then also, you're also using your name, image, and likeness, right? If we decide that we want to run a campaign or put your face on an employer website or whatever it is, like I look back at some of the things that I did as an employer, whether it was starting and forming ERGs. This was before the word ERG was even born, I'm pretty sure. Forgot what they called it. But between being in commercials for the company, whether it was like internal or corporate things, whatever, like those are things that we get paid for now as entrepreneurs, as a part of these panels, as part of campaigns and those kinds of things. But I just always find it interesting when corporate employees, traditionally employed people, like don't see themselves in these kinds of situations. And that's one of the things that going back to the top of the conversation that I thought was really interesting. And I think is really important for people to get out of this is like, you have to look at the deal as a whole, which is part of what we've been saying is like, I've outgrown that labor model. Not to say that I'll never do it, because who knows what's later on down the future. But there's certain elements of the labor model, as most people have pretty much subscribed to, that is just deeply and inherently exploitative.
Yeah.
And I just absolutely refuse to kind of play that game. And so all of that to say, that was a big part of the conversation as well. And I'm glad that he's doing what he's doing. I want to see even more of that happening to affect everybody in all other industries.
To your point about messages and models that transcend your specific identifier, whether you're a corporate employee or you're a creative person or you're an independent artist, I think pay yourself first and make sure that you retain as much of your IP as possible are messages that transcend whatever you call yourself. Pay yourself first is the way to do things.
Yeah.
And you're right. It requires a level of psychological mindset to be able to hear that, not apply a layer of ego to think you're above it and actually do something about it. We hear it all the time on airplanes. When you get on an airplane and they're going through the safety instructions, they'll tell you, like, make sure that you put your mask on first. If you are traveling with someone who is incapable of doing it, you put yours on first. But there are so many of us that hear that and it's like, man, whatever. I sacrifice my life for my child. If something go down, I'm reaching for their mask first. And the problem is we're not giving the airlines enough credit. They're telling us this for a reason. They're telling us this because if you are unconscious, you will mess around and harm both of you, right? Like you have to be able to understand and apply situational priorities. Of course, you would sacrifice your life for your child. Of course, you have things that you want to do with your art and goals for your family and things that you want to do for your career. But in a given situation, which in this case is income coming in from wherever you get paid, in a given situation, you have to prioritize paying yourself first, regardless of what everybody else needs. And again, learning how to ignore that gut instinct that comes from all of the things, your childhood, your money stories, what you've seen, your trauma, ignoring that to apply this greater lesson and this greater strategy around if I'm not good, nobody's good. Is work. It takes a long time. That's the inner work. That's part of it is figuring out like, why do I not do this? Why do I continue to put my long-term needs behind all of the things that I think are more important than my baseline survival?
Yeah. So going back to the talk and the panel, there were some mentions of some specific tactics and accounts and those kinds of things. And so savings accounts and the importance of savings accounts came up quite a bit. What I really enjoyed were the mentions of brokerage accounts. You just don't hear it that often. We've done a couple of podcasts on the importance of having a brokerage account. Even I would think on X a couple of days ago, someone asked a question and it was interesting, like perfect timing. They were saying, hey, what's the best a type of account to have for, a creative or someone who has inconsistent or gig income. And we didn't mention actual brokerage accounts, but the question was like, which IRA would be the best? And so it was really, really good to see that. The overall point here is that, going back to what I was saying before, we have to break this idea that if you aren't traditionally employed, you can't save for retirement. 401ks, unfortunately, are so popular that they have become synonymous with the act of saving and investing for retirement. And so many people think that if they're not part of an employer-sponsored plan, they can't do it on their own. We know otherwise. We talk about that in our investing class. We talk about that in our book. I was really happy to see that it was also brought up there, specifically the value that's found in brokerage accounts, like just having a separate account that allows you to buy stocks, mutual funds, bonds, whatever it is at any time based on the market price, and just gives you maximum flexibility. There's no earning limits, none of the things that typically come with 401ks and all of those other accounts. The conversation also veered towards entrepreneurship and and the idea of pricing yourself.
Well, we didn't get into that, and I wanted to. Ronnie brought it up a couple of times.
It came up a little bit in response to other things. And I
that's
thought that
a huge part of being able to pay yourself first.
Correct.
Is to make sure that your work or your salary is priced appropriately.
Correct. Yeah. It was mentioned and I've had enough conversations. We've had enough conversations with creatives and freelancers around like their inability to kind of keep all of these things together and accomplish all of their financial goals. And I always find that there is like resistance because they still struggle with the idea that they can actually charge more for the work that they already do. And we've been there. We've had our own struggles with that, but we started to realize like, not only do you need to be charging that margin just to continue the sustainability of your business, you also need to be charging enough to incorporate enough for taxes. You need to be adding a little bit of cushion just in case things go a little bit awry because some expenses are variable and so on and so on. And it's something that I think, is I think probably always going to be a struggle for a lot of entrepreneurs. It's a struggle for traditionally employed peoples too, but like we have to grow comfortable with charging more. And honestly, I think the best way to do it is to throw it out there, which means like you've got to save and invest and build enough of a cushion to be able to test those limits. You have to be willing to actually lose this potential deal or lose this offer and find out, well, it wasn't because of the money. And when you realize it wasn't because of the money, it was like, oh, all right, well, cool. That's a great indicator. That's insightful. That lets me know that I can actually charge a little bit more for my work. And that's actually, final point I'll make here is that one of the benefits of being an entrepreneur is that you just get more opportunities to test your pricing, I think, a little bit more than you do as a traditionally employed or someone who works for somebody else. Like you can bounce around and keep asking for jobs, but you just don't get as many reps as you might be able to get as an entrepreneur. And I think the more reps you get, the better at negotiating you become, the more flexible and creative you can become with trying to figure out other ways to get compensated for the work and the value.
And the more options that you have for coming up with well thought out plan Bs. Because as we talked about with Kim, the best way to negotiate is to have a plan B. The person who has the best alternative to the negotiated agreement is the person who holds the power in the negotiation. And when you are an entrepreneur, you can say, yes, I'm going to pitch this person, but if they don't work, then I'm going to do these two other things so that I don't feel completely deflated if this doesn't fall through. I don't feel as tied to the result because I have all of these plan Bs. And I think when you are a creator, when you are independent, whether it's freelance or, side hustling, you just have to get good at coming up with multiple options and trying them all.
Yeah.
One of the other things that I liked about the conversation is when Jack asked about men and self-care and soft life, because she brought up, some of the things that you're saying where it does come off as very feminine, not to gender it, but it does come off as something that women are more interested in men. And she asked about some of the ways that we can support the men in our lives with their self-care and mental well-being. How do we help them prioritize it? And I'm not gonna lie, I felt a little awkward when she asked it. Like I felt like some of those all male panels at the Women's Empowerment Conference where it's like, why are you asking me? I'm not a man. But at the same time, I understood the value in the question because I do have a lot of men in my life, whether it's you, my brother, my dad, just friends. Yeah. And I don't know how I'm doing in terms of helping them prioritize their self-care. Like I lead by example.
Yeah, I think that's oftentimes, is enough, right? It's the encouragement in letting them know that there's a safe space, that they are encouraged, living through example, like not making them feel bad if you feel that they might be like kind of doing that traditional, men don't cry sort of thing. And it's like, no, you can talk about it. And I think oftentimes just sharing some of the information that you've had the privilege of acquiring over the years, which, you may realize that they haven't had the time to do that in a work that you've been able to do, and just kind of guiding them in certain directions while also being clear on some warning signs, saying, hey, man, I get that these are the people that you've been listening to and seeking counsel from or getting inspiration from. Just know that they tend to represent or embody or support these kinds of ideals, and that might actually be contributing to the issues that you're dealing with. And so when you and I have had enough conversations with people, and I've seen you engage with enough men in your life to talk about those things and to challenge those things and to help push them along. And so, yeah, I would say I think you do a pretty good job. You probably just don't recognize that you do it.
Well, thank you.
I think For me, it was just like I said earlier, like I started thinking about it. I was like, I guess I do live a pretty soft life and I'm proud of it, man. Like, I enjoy the ease that we've been able to build and to apply. It's not to say that it's always easy, you know what I mean?
Right.
But like we have, I think, more control over the gears that make this household, that make this family kind of move than what most people do, right? And that's ultimately what this is about. Like, you want to just have as much control. Like, I know how much we have. I know how long it'll last us versus like not really knowing and it being contingent on things or people or levers that exist outside of your kind of reach.
Yeah.
And I think that's ultimately what a lot of people are working towards. So the last question on the panel was, that typical final advice.
I know.
Any wise words? It's oftentimes like an opportunity to drop some poetry. Do you remember what you said?
I think I went with my standard answer because I had used all my other answers. But the question was for people who want to enjoy life and be an entrepreneur and have financial independence, what would you tell them? And it's like, well, I've already told y'all, be rich and regular, like invest. So I think I went with your money can work harder than you. It's just a reminder that we take a lot of pride in our work ethic. We take a lot of pride in our creativity. But let me tell you what is ultimately more creative, ultimately working harder, is money. Money can be a creative solution to almost any problem, legal or illegal. It is the Swiss Army knife of problem solvers.
It always reminds me early on in my career, one of the best advice that I got from one of the chefs that I used to work with, and I might have still been a teenager at the time, but he basically said something to the effect of like the biggest problem with a lot of chefs is that they have no idea what it feels like to pay $10 for a salad. Mm-hmm. And what he was referring to was that, we all know that it's hard work, right? You get in there, you're a chef, you're working behind the scenes, you're working on your feet, hot kitchen, all that stuff. And the pay is not that great for a lot of them. But they don't know what it's like to actually pay $10 for that salad. And his reference was really a matter of like us just kind of throwing it together, not putting as much love into the salad as you might the steak or the lamb or the lobster or something like that. Like because you never paid $10 for it. You think it's just an afterthought, right? And what I've learned over the years, especially since I've left the kitchen, is that I eat a lot better than my friends who are still cooking, right? Who are still chefs. And it's not to say that I'm better than them, but it's to say that this is what money affords you. You know what I mean? Like the ability, like you can still eat well, even though you're not connected to the industry like you used to be. You just have the flexibility. You can travel. You can do things that like you thought you could only do through the job, right? Like this is the real kind of perk of what a soft life or a financially independent life or whatever it is that you want to call it can offer you. And so, yeah, it just kind of, I think, brings to the forefront like why these things are so important and to give people the comfort in knowing that like there's so much to be gained from being financially responsible and making good financial decisions. And so, yeah, that may seem a little obvious, but like, it's not always just around the things that you can buy. It's really just the things that you can experience and the ease, to your point, that it brings to your life. So good job.
Perfect ending. I had another question, but I think we can just wrap right there.
Okay, well, let's wrap.
All right, y'all. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Rich and Regular podcast. If you'd like a suggestion for something easy to do that adds some ease to my life, it's leave a 5-star rating and review on your favorite podcast platform or leave a comment below and we'll keep the conversation going. We will see y'all next week. If you like videos like this and want to see more, make sure you click subscribe and turn on notifications.